And we have the town manager, mayor extraordinaire here, my brother Max Smith, and his lovely niece, what's her name? No, Caden. He brings Caden along to help carry the money from all the book sales, I think. Net proceeds from any sales tonight go to the Stockton Historical Society. I want to thank the manager of Fort Knox, Dean Martin, and the helpers that have, his helpers, let's see, Sammy Davis Jr., Jerry Lewis, yeah. And last but not least, all the way from Connecticut, my daughter and her family, Leslie Smith, husband Tom, and Benny the boy. That's the one laying on the grass. Over 20 years ago, I had the absolute honor to listen to meet, talk with, and listen to James Michener. He came to an Alaska Air Carriers meeting in Reno and didn't charge us anything because he wanted to meet those air carriers and see if they'd give him rides into the willy whackers of Alaska, into the back country, which people did gladly, of course, because he was getting ready to write his book, Alaska. And I remember his keynote speech. He said, "It is the greatest act of conceit to sit down and begin writing a book, because you have to think somebody's going to be interested in it." And so I have my great act of conceit tonight to get you all here, and I am hoping somebody will be interested in what I got to tell you. Our neighbor Sarah Legere asked Elu, our sound technician and my wife, what it was that got me started in this, and I'll tell you, it's my daughter. She called me one day from the National Archives. I was still in Alaska, and she said, "I'm at the archives. I've pulled the file on William Ellis, my mother's maiden name, and he is my great-great-grandfather. He is the man I'm attached to in order to be eligible to join the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War." I'm shortening that to SUVCW. And she found two fascinating things. The first was a photo of William, which we had none prior to that. But in this photo, it showed the stump of his leg where it had been amputated. He lost the leg in the Second Battle of Bull Run. Now that's an unusual photo. And I said to Leslie, keep digging in that folder. There's got to be an explanation of why a farm family who could not afford a professional photo would do that. And indeed, she found a letter from the brand new Veterans Administration. He had applied for a pension. Obviously, he's not going to do much farming anymore. And this new bureaucracy wrote him a letter demanding that he prove that he was still an amputee. Now, the difference between a fairy tale and one of my stories is it'll end with, "I kid you not." So I had to make a copy of that in my next visit to the VA. I took it with me, snapped it open, said, when you read this, you'll realize not much has changed. At that time, I dug out my grandmother's book, The Story of Stockton Springs. Alice Ellis wrote it, Mother's Mother, or she compiled it, I really should say. And in it was a list of 101 men from Stockton who were in the Civil War. Turns out it's 100 because one of them used the first name middle on the first enlistment, middle first on the second. At any rate, I decided, because I worked so much with Find a Grave, that I would find where they're all buried. Simple. Not so simple. That was going on 5 years ago. And I have maybe 60% of the burials documented. There is an incredible number of burials that either are totally unmarked or volunteers from Find a Grave haven't stumbled over them yet and recorded them. So in doing this research, it wasn't just family I'm looking at, although I had good reason to do that. But I've looked at all 100 people. There's some I can't find a thing about, a few. And what I wanted to know was, when did they enlist, which unit? Did they get banged up, killed, or die of disease? And when they came home, what became of them? Because, like Gordon said so well in that last piece, it is a rich man's war. It is a poor man's fight. And there were no rich men from Stockton who took up arms. None. Some came back and distinguished themselves, but no, this was a poor man's fight. And my own wife has said, at the end, I'm going to take the time to read you the names of the ones who were killed and the ones who died of disease. 100, it makes for easy percentages. 17 killed, 15 died of disease, 32% never came home. And Helu said, I have to almost cry for the mothers. So this is my love letter to those 100 men, because it was all about slavery. They blow smoke and tell you it had to do with states' rights and other explanations, but at the bottom, it was the rich man who owned a number of slaves and therefore had assets that were unbelievable. Some of the richest counties in the country at the time were in the South. And they had no real industrial base. It was assets accumulated in slaves and breeding slaves. So the fight was about slavery and the 4 years and the 32 men and the wounded who came back. It was all about freeing the blacks. Life in Stockton, 1860 census, there was 1,595 people. Fast forward to 2010, there were 4 less, 1,591. So we can imagine what the size of the town was, although it was, you'd have to picture in your mind the horses, the buggies, the dirt roads, and so on. 10 months into the war, Congress realized that this was not going to be a quick fight. They signed up units originally to be 90-day units. That was the contract with these men, thinking that if they threw enough Yankees at the South, they'd knuckle. They didn't. 10 months into the war, they realized they couldn't afford the war. So they printed the greenback. Money out of thin air. It's not backed by gold, it's not backed by silver. Does anybody hear anything familiar in that? They created the Legal Tender Act and they issued $150 million round one, $300 million again in 1863 when we were right in the thickest part of the fight. And what happened, the minute those greenbacks hit the streets, every one of you were alive then if you had copper coin, bronze coin, silver, nickel, or gold. You did not spend them because you realized this is real. Monopoly hadn't been invented yet, but this is monopoly money. And yet they made it work because it was a medium of exchange, but they dumped so much money into the economy. Then 1863, the price of flour, the big staple, had already doubled. Excuse me. Bacon went from $1.25 a pound to $10. Sugar increased 15 times, coffee 40. All kinds of money, too few goods. So as a result of hoarding the coins, all you had was greenbacks. They were folding $1 and higher. If you went to the store and bought $1.27 worth of flour, how in the devil did they make change? Postage stamps. Mystic Stamp Company was the one that turned me on to this idea. They would keep sheets of stamps and issue those, and those became currency. They were thought of more highly than the greenback. The other thing that happened is very early in the war, the post office realized that there was untold money in the post offices of the South in unsold stamps. And they were afraid that the post offices and even the Army of the South would collect those and send them north as cash and buy armaments in order to hurt our troops. So there had been up to 62 stamps issued from the beginning of the post office to that date. They demonetized those stamps. You had 6 days to trade them for the new issues, and the South was stuck. They couldn't use the stockpile they had. So the war begins in April of 1861 with the bombing of Fort Sumter. And I want to talk about 3 families. One of the families in Stockton that stepped up in mass was the Ellis family, my own. It got me into this, so I'm going to talk about it a little bit. William Ellis, the one with the picture of the stump, joined 28 May 1861, just over 1 month after Sumter got attacked. He joined the 2nd Maine, and the 2nd Maine, turns out, was the first regiment that went to Washington in order to join the war. The boys in the 1st Maine were down in Portland, and they were all suffering from the measles, and they couldn't go anywhere. There was Isaac and Edie Staples Ellis, had 6 boys, 1 died in infancy, 5 possible. 4 are known to have served, and I'm not convinced the 5th one didn't. William Ellis, who was out of the fight after Battle of First Bull Run. Crawford Ellis also joined Company B of the 2nd Infantry. And he's on my killed in action list. Walter T. Ellis joined the 17th United States Infantry. So he was a federale. He survived. Wilbert Ellis, sea captain by trade, took 2 years in the Navy. And when that gig was up, he joined Company D of the 1st Maine Cavalry, and I'll be darned if he didn't get captured. He's one of our POWs. He spent time in Libby and Bell prison camps for 9 months in both books about Stockton. There was one written well before Alice Ellis's. Tell about Wilbert Ellis attending meetings and entertaining the crowd with accounts of the suffering that he went through as a POW. The Southerners would stake him out in the grass, no water, blazing sun, put a bridle or spur, one of the two, in his mouth so he couldn't swallow. He died earlier than many, and it's in the books that they say that was because of the lingering effects of his torture. So the Ellis family starts with 4 who served out of 5. 1 killed, 1 lost a leg, 1's a POW and tortured, 1 made it just fine. Roberts, Sylvanus Roberts, had 2 wives, 1 called Remember Record, the other Mary Jane Thompson. Between the 3, they had 5 sons, 4 of military age. 3 served and 1 survived. And I know that's different than your data, and we'll reconcile that. Orpheus Roberts made it to lieutenant, died on the 2nd day of Gettysburg at the Devil's Den. And that was the subject of the speech I gave a month ago that's on our Facebook page. The recording is on the Facebook page. There was Edwin Roberts. We don't know who he enlisted with at this time, but he got detached to gunboat service, and he died on the 25th of January, 1963. Lloyd Roberts was a 1-year Navy substitute for Wilson Hitchborn, and although nobody in Find a Grave found him and documented him, I found a death certificate with his cemetery on it, and I've created a page for him. So Roberts had 4 possible, 3 served, 1 survived. Reuel and Mariah Gray had 4 sons, and they all went in. Only 1 would come home, and he's buried in Massachusetts. Augustus Gray was wounded in Fredericksburg. He died in 1962. Sewell Gray died in 1962, was buried on the field. I got that wrong. Augustus died of disease. And Robert Gray, who you'll hear more of, one of our POWs, died at the Battle of Wilderness. They put him on an ambulance wagon, and as they were driving him to a hospital, he died while in Fredericksburg. Fortunately for us, Robert had married and had children before he went in. And we have his great-great-grandson, also called Robert Gray, as a member of the Stockton Historical Society. You made it up.
I made it up.
Now I'm going to give you Kathy. She's going to talk to you about a relative of one of our captains of the 19th Infantry. Daniel, if I only had a brain, Dickey. Anybody recognize that little ditty? Da-dun, dun, 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 dun. If I only had a brain. Well, you'll know in a second why. Kathy.
Okay, this person did not serve in the Civil War. She wasn't born until well after the Civil War. But she not only had a grandfather who served, she had 2 uncles who served. And I'm going to start with a little bit of genealogy so that you can understand who we're talking about. Captain Daniel Dickey married Mary Berry well before the Civil War. Their 3rd child was Isaac Berry Dickey, who became a sea captain. He married Harriet Grant Mudgett, who was the younger sister of Louis P. and William Mudgett, both of whom served with distinction in the Civil War. The Grant, Berry, Mudgett, and Dickey families were all in this area well before 1800. Captain Isaac Dickey and Harriet Dickey had 5 children. The oldest 4 were all born in Stockton, but the youngest was born aboard his ship, the Willard Mudgett, in Hong Kong Harbour. It's quite likely, since he was in the China trade and the 4 older children were born in Stockton, that he had not been present at the birth of any of the older children. So in Hong Kong, he was trying unsuccessfully to get a doctor to come aboard ship. Luckily for him, in the harbor was the ship Wealthy Pendleton with William Blanchard of Searsport captain. Captain Blanchard had delivered several of his own children because his wife Clara almost always traveled with him at sea. The Blanchards offered to come aboard the ship and oversee the birth of the baby. The Dickeys readily agreed. And on June 4th, 1876, the youngest Dickey came into the world. The baby was named Clara for Mrs. Blanchard, and her middle name was Blanchard for both of the Blanchards. In September 1876, the Willard Mudgett made port in Hawaii. On the crew and passenger list were Captain Dickey, Mrs. Dickey, their 5 children, including Clara, 3 months old. This is an important piece of information because, like many women, over the years, Clara kept changing her birth year, making herself younger. But this piece of documentation says very definitely she was born in 1876. We don't know when the Willard Mudgett made it back to New England, and we don't know for sure how long Clara spent in Stockton, but there are several newspaper articles that mention her spending significant time as a child in Stockton. With her grandparents there, aunts and uncles and cousins, it's no surprise that she would spend time there. By 1880, the entire family was living in Quincy, Massachusetts. And at a fairly young age, Clara became enthralled with acting. By 1900, she and one of her sisters were living in New York City. Her sister is listed as a bookkeeper, but Clara, age 24, is listed as an actress in the 1900 census. Clara acted in plays on both on and off Broadway, including one Pulitzer Prize-winning play in which she had the lead. She took the stage name Clara Blandick, combining her middle name Blanchard and her last name Dickey. Besides the theater, Clara worked in silent movies, traveling stage companies, and entertained the troops in Europe during World War I. We know of at least once in October in 1902 that Clara was in Belfast starring in a play, The Christian, that was performed by a traveling stage company at the Belfast Opera House. Clara was able to successfully make the transition to talkie movies. Not everyone was able to do that. And by 1930, she was living in Hollywood. By that time, she was over 50, and instead of being the young star, she was a character actress. She worked in all the major studios of the time, and we know she was in over 100 films, but the exact number is not known, for as a character actress, she often was not named in the credits. She was in movies, though, with stars like Greta Garbo, Joan Crawford, Barbara Stanwyck, Spencer Tracy, and Clark Gable, often playing the mother of one of the leading characters. In one week, in 1939, she had the part that has kept her memory alive until today. That part was Auntie Em in The Wizard of Oz. She worked for 1 week. She was paid $750, a lot of money in that time. By 1940, Clara was already in her 60s. During this time, her eyesight started to fail, and she started to have arthritis that progressively worsened. She worked as long as she could, but finally, her health made it necessary for her to retire. She died on April 15, 1962, and her ashes were interred in Forest Lawn Cemetery in Los Angeles, California. She was almost 86, had had a long and very productive life as an actress. So I'll turn it back to Charlie.
If only had a brain. There's no place like home. I looked at that little clip of Auntie Em, and I remember I was just a whisker, Skeet and I both, when that came out on our black and white TV. We didn't realize it was half black and white and half color because all we had was a black and white TV. Scared the pee-wee out of us. And I remember how comforting Auntie Em was when little Miss Ruby Slippers is laying there clicking them going, there's no place like home when she's home at bed. Auntie Em, she's got a place in my heart. The Wizard of Oz was made in 1937, released in Green Bay in 1939. Clara was 63 then. Daniel had died in 1872, 68 years before the release, and her dad Isaac had died at sea, 1884, 55 years before. And I'm sorry for them that they couldn't know how beloved Clara Blandick was. But then, if any of you don't know, I sell gravestones. And one day I was in the yard when a couple of men pulled in. Daniel Dickey had died. And I said, he's not related to that guy buried on the Cape that was in the Civil War. And this James Dickey is a customer. He may see this, and I didn't ask his permission to use his name, but what the heck, this is a great story. And I asked him, here's this guy, hair flying, I've got shorts in the summer and t-shirt, and they're covered with that glue that we use. Looked like heck. And this ignorant-looking guy turns to James and says, James, do you realize you're related to Clara Blandick, Auntie Em? How did you know that? I enjoy doing that kind of thing. I want to take a quick commercial break. Mac, are you awake? Wander up here for a minute, would you? When we get to Gettysburg, a lot happens that involves Stockton. Orpheus Roberts, I mentioned before, the lieutenant, there were 2 boys out of 3 in the Roberts family who died. He was killed. His company the company within the regiment was sent into the Devil's Den to try to clean the nest of Confederates out that in a roundabout way at some distance was threatening Little Round Top. And if any of you have seen the movie Gettysburg with Jeff Daniels, and I haven't reviewed it recently, but Joshua Chamberlain from Brewer, Maine, and Brunswick, Maine, is held out to be the hero of Gettysburg because he's got the leftmost position of the Union Army. And if they let the Confederates attack the left, particularly from the side, they can just start rolling up our people. So it was critical, and he was told it was critical, to hold Little Round Top, but you're often given this order, you hold this at all costs. And you do, until you just can't anymore. Well, Joshua was on a hilltop with his men, and they fired every bullet they had. And he ended up ordering a bayonet charge. So they fixed bayonets, and down the hill they go, tearing into, help me Gary, 47th Alabama, I think. And these guys coming up the hill, the Alabama boys, were so shocked that many of them just surrendered right there. It saved Round Top, it saved the Union left, and later Joshua got a Congressional Medal of Honor for that. Orpheus Roberts, like so many men, played his part in the Devil's Den, not only helping protect Round Top, but also there was some critical artillery that he kept the Confederates away from. And so he dies there. We've got other men that are injured. 3 days of fighting, it's finally over. The South, General Lee was allowed pretty much to retreat without being molested, which really infuriated Lincoln. But that was July 1, 2, 3 of 1863. Congress and others thought that there should be so many dead, they thought they should start a national cemetery and do it in a park style. 19th of November, 1863 was the Gettysburg Address. They had some orator who went on and on, I don't know, a couple hours. And Lincoln got up and spoke, and it was one small piece of paper. He was done before the photographers realized they needed to be taking the pictures. We had one Stockton man Corporal Franklin Patterson, who had been wounded at Gettysburg. He was in hospital at York, Virginia. He was elected by the men in the ward to be the one to go to Gettysburg to represent the hospital. So we had one of the Patterson family in attendance. And if you read my grandmother's book, and it matters what she says in there, she misattributed who that was. She had picked the name of Franklin's son, Paul Revere Patterson, and God knows it makes a better story with a name like Paul Revere Patterson. But Paul Revere hadn't been born by then, so. This was Franklin. Another thing that surrounds Gettysburg is a cyclorama that was done after the war, an enormous round painting. To really see it, you even have to climb a ladder to a platform in different places. That was put up in Boston in a brick building built just for it. And it was an enormously popular attraction. The painting was of battle scenes at Gettysburg. St. Louis Fair, was an international fair, I think. World Fair, 4-year thing. It's coming up. They disassembled the cyclorama and moved it to St. Louis. And after a 4-year run at St. Louis and nothing going on in the cyclorama building in Boston, it was decided that the popularity would have waned, and they stored the cyclorama for a long time. Early in 2000, as Gettysburg was coming up on an important anniversary, they decided to get that out of storage, build their own building and platforms and ladders, reassemble it, touch it up where they needed to. And when they did that, they found an enormous section of that cyclorama had gone missing. Stolen, destroyed, didn't get from, who knows? It's missing. And it's not to be found. They also knew that there was a company called Rowell and something in Boston that had professionally photographed that entire cyclorama. And there were 5 photographs that they needed desperately in order to put an artist to the job of restructuring, rebuilding that painting. They looked everywhere, including eBay. They couldn't find it. I'm up in Alaska for 30 years, and I came home. I have my toe in the water about Civil War. I met my daughter Leslie. We went to the Stockton Historical Society. Claudia Dresser, I think, was the one manning it that day at the Masonic Building. And she said, dig into anything you want to. And we did, and Leslie found a large envelope, not thick, but big, and it said Civil War. And she pulled that out and handed it to me unopened and said, you might be interested in this. Might be. Opened it up and there's 5 photos from a Rowell and Company. I didn't know they were looking for this. Excuse me. And at first, Leslie and I are looking at it, and that's a photo of a battle. And then, we're pretty smart, aren't we, Leslie? We figured out that in those days, photography could not record motion like that. The slightest move and you see pictures of blurs. Claudia didn't know what it was, so I convinced Claudia to take them home, scan them, give me a disc. When I went back to Fairbanks, a woman I worked with who owned over 1,000 books on the Civil War, I took the disc to her and said, look at these and see what you make of it. Well, she didn't know what we were looking at either. She emailed them immediately to Sue Boardman in Pennsylvania, Gettysburg, a registered battlefield guide, and said, Sue, you got any idea what this is? 20 minutes later, the phone's ringing. Oh my God, where did you get these? We have searched the world. Well, got them at the Historical Society in Stockton Springs, Maine. They were able to work from the email scans, rebuilt the cyclorama, had the grand opening. And it is there today, complete and accurate, because of our Historical Society and Leslie's curiosity. Thank you, Leslie. It's so rare I get to thank her about that. Again, it's all about slavery. And about 1863, Lincoln and Congress relented and decided to allow blacks to be combatants. And they created, there were a couple of different names for local black regiments, but for ones that were U.S. government sponsored, they were called colored troops. It was not something a man left his hometown with a goal in mind to become a commander of colored troops. In fact, there was probably some resistance to the idea. Nonetheless, Lewis Mudgett, Stockton Springs, was killed in action 9 April 1865. His rating was adjutant. That's the equivalent of major. It couldn't get more middle-of-the-road officer rank. He had a colonel and a lieutenant colonel in charge of this colored regiment, and they were in Mobile, Alabama. Unfortunately, word had not got to Mobile that the war was over. And the colonel and the lieutenant colonel were unfit for duty that day. It's not explained in Grandmother's book or anywhere else that I can find what made them unfit, but it could be anything from illness to alcohol. And Lewis assumed command, led the colored troops who performed valiantly. They accomplished their objective, but he took a bullet in the head. The official ending of the war was about 6 weeks later. Last shot was 22 June, and he died 9 April. So yeah, not even 2 months left to go, and he's buried in Mount Prospect, Stockton, very near the maintenance shed. We had William Mudgett, who was commander of the 80th U.S. Colored Troops, full commander. And he was a full colonel, and they gave him what they call a brevet promotion. In other words, you get the stars but not the pay. Brevet promotion to brigadier general. Stockton man. Cassius Clay Roberts, I love the name. Cassius Clay served in units before and after that were main units, but in the middle, he was part of the command structure, like Lewis had been. They commanded colored troops in Louisiana. We have a lot to be proud of in our town. We had at least, and one pops up every once in a while, we had at least 3 POWs. Robert Gray, who I mentioned before in the Gray family rundown, one of them that was killed, went into that first battle of the war, first Bull Run, got shot in the hand and the chest, and was captured. He escaped 9 days later when he noticed that he wasn't at a POW camp yet. And he noticed that the Confederates weren't keeping a close eye on the wounded. So he stole a Confederate outfit, jacket, and just wandered away from camp. Made his way to the Potomac. His hand was broken, but he hung on to a log with his good arm and swam with his bad arm. 34 hours after he broke out, he made contact with the Union Army again, and it happened to be a Maine outfit. They patched him up, and they thought he was so brave they sent him home on furlough, a very rare thing. And then he was back in the fight and promoted. Warren Griffin, also captured at First Battle of Bull Run, spent 10 months in confinement. He wrote a diary while in there. He wrote it in the margins and spaces of his personal Bible. That still exists, although it went to auction, and somebody who's not associated with us in any way, or the family, now owns it. And my own great-uncle Matthew Ellis, I forget where he was captured, doesn't matter. Spent 10 months in Libby and Bell Prison. He's the one that I've recounted, was tortured badly, and he liked to regale people with those stories. Now I want to tell you something about our old veterans. It is more or less reliably reported. See, Togus was the first VA facility in the country. I don't know if anybody knew that. At the height of it, Togus had as many as 2,700 veterans, and they were from all over the country, that were domiciled there, kind of as a lame and lazy old veterans home, but they had medical as well, where today it's an acute care hospital. And President and Congress charged the VA with caring for the veteran, his widow and orphan. And except for writing letters demanding to know if you're still an amputee, they did a pretty good job of it. Togus had its own band. It had theatrical performances. There was something to do all the time. And indeed, it was lively enough that people used to take the small railroad from Augusta on weekends and go be entertained at the old Veterans Center. And it is reliably said. Now let me back up one more time. There's a story floating around that saltpeter, which is a big component in gunpowder, was used on the troops to, what did they call it? Give me a second, because this is kind of fun. To quell their amorous ways. Now, Caden, your Uncle Mac will explain what I mean later. So I've got this statement from McGill University of Montreal saying that just isn't so, it didn't happen. Well, Bert and Ephraim were a couple old soldiers who disagree. And it's reliably reported that they were rocking in their rocking chairs on the porch of Togus sometime after the war, when Bert turned to Ephraim and he said, "Ephraim, you remember that powder they used to give us so we wouldn't mind the pretty ladies?" And Ephraim said, "Yeah, Bert, I do." Bert said, "Ephraim, I reckon it's beginning to work." I love the story of Peleg Staples. I don't want to get out of this recording and presentation without thanking C. Lee Burton. C. Lee Burton is an indefatigable researcher in North Carolina, a direct descendant of Peleg Staples, who served honorably in the war and then migrated south to North Carolina, where he met some, and Don, I told the story wrong the other day. It wasn't some guy who took over a Staples woman. Nonetheless, I bet she was happy too. Peleg wandered down there and found a Southern belle and married her. And when he died, they put him in the family cemetery in the lower 40 of the farm. And C. Lee tells me that to this day, the family complains about the damn Yankee buried in the backyard. The people oh, Mac, I'm sorry. Come on back up. I'll get you right on. I forgot you were there. You've gotten so small, my friend. The people in the South do not realize that damn Yankee's two different words, you see. And I had a friend from Kentucky that was in my unit, John Clark. She knew him. John and I were sitting around one day talking about farming. Now, when I talk about farming, it's a big home garden. When he talks about farming, it's a farm. And I said to John, I don't know, you might have known John. I said to John, I find the best thing on strawberries is well-rotted cow manure. And he looked at me and said, I prefer cream and sugar. Southerners think different. God, I'm glad to see you again. Margaret, you still here? Margaret McGrath joined us earlier. Come on up, brother. My brother has written his fourth book. He has a book mill that's second only to Stephen King. I read the first one, Maynard's on the Titanic, and I thought, well, I better read this so I sound like I know what I'm doing. Jesus, I couldn't put it down. The second one was about Peyton Place being filmed, and I wasn't as excited, but it was a good, solid bit of Maine history. He never gave me a free copy of the third book. I haven't touched it. He did give me a copy of The Siege that was just released July 1st. I ate that thing alive, and Kathy has too. And although we come from two different political persuasions, we both agree it is dynamite. And I'll have him spend a couple minutes, we're still in time budget, telling you a little bit about the book, and don't leave here without buying it, or at least promising you will, because it's that good. Malcolm Smith.
All right, folks. Thank you. Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? Siege of the State House is my fourth book. It's through Down East Books, and it just came out a month ago. What it tells, this is a little-known story of Maine history. It directly involves the Civil War. It took place about 14 years after the Civil War, and it directly is a result of the Civil War. And it tells the story of General Joshua Chamberlain's heroism and his fortitude. And I'm just going to read the back and call it good. Siege at the State House tells the true story of a coup that was attempted by Maine's then governor and the leaders of a new political party, the Greenbackers, almost plunging the United States into a second civil war. With the Maine State House under siege for several weeks by a conspiratorial force, the occupation culminated in a showdown between armed rebels and Civil War hero General Joshua Chamberlain. In the dramatic confrontation, Chamberlain stood on the State House steps, exposing his chest and daring any man present to settle the standoff with violence if they dared. It was an event that Chamberlain called another Round Top. Elements of this fascinating story include a Christmas Day raid on Maine's weapons arsenal, missing election results, and the 7 jackasses. So if you get a chance, if you want to buy a copy, you can get it online. Any bookstore will order it for you if they don't already have it. And it's just a good piece of history we should know more about. Thank you. Thank you, Charlie.
Now that our mother's been gone a number of years, I still look at the fact that the first book he wrote, she traveled with him all over maritime Canada, researching it. That took you 10 years, didn't it, for the first? Yep. But Mother was in tow and greatly entertained, and thank you for that. Next thing, I do not want to make the mistake of overlooking the Sons of Union Veterans Civil War. These are important guys to me. The Grand Army of the Republic was that organization that was created for camaraderie and patriotism by the men who fought in the Civil War. And it was put together in such a way that when the last man died, the GAR disappeared. We are the congressionally authorized survivors of the GAR, descendants of the GAR. Sons of Union veterans, to get in, you have to be man to start with, although they have a woman's program too. And you have to prove your lineage back to a Civil War soldier. So William Ellis, the one with the leg, was my link. Turns out I could have gone 4 different ways just on the Ellis side. The SUVCW does a number of things, but probably the most important in the way I look at the world is they're dedicated to finding the graves of Civil War soldiers and documenting them on both Facebook and the SUVCW International Database. Steve Gibbons on the left and I are 2 of the 3 men in Maine who are authorized to do exactly that. If you're male, particularly male, with a direct relative back to the Civil War, we'd love to have you join us. A number of hands make the job a little easier. Did I cover that pretty well, Steve? And beside him is the state commander, Peter Redmond. He comes out of the Bangor branch. Or are you going to be Lincoln when that's all shook out?
No, I'm still staying Bangor. Yeah, Bangor.
Yep. Okay. We had 32 out of 100 that died. Killed. My family was the first to lose a man. Crawford Ellis, my great-great uncle, the man with the leg amputation's brother, died at the Battle of Hanover Courthouse. He was wounded there and died a month later, 6 June 1862. A man who served with him in the same company, Joel Thomas, wounded that day, died 19 June. Sewell Gray, 4th Maine, died in Fredericksburg, 13 December 1862. Simon Barrett, that's your relative, Kathy, right? He died at the Battle of Irish Bend, 14 April 1863. Henry Rendell also died in that battle. Those men do not have gravestones at their burial site because they were buried in a ditch of a road. Simeon Barrett does have a cenotaph remembrance stone in Stockton. Orpheus Roberts, I mentioned before, died defending the Devil's Den, 2nd of July, 1863. No gravestone where he fell. He was buried on the field. Enoch Dow died the next day. Got shot in the head and the leg. Robert Gray was in the Battle of Wilderness. He was wounded, put him on one of those horse-drawn ambulances. As they're taking him through Fredericksburg, he died. So they took the body to the Fredericksburg cemetery and buried him and marked it. A friend of his was back through a week or so later, and Robert was gone. And when they asked questions about where did you put Robert's body, they could never get an answer. They didn't want a damn Yankee buried in their cemetery. Thomas Blanchard, 12 May 1864, Spotsylvania. Whitefield Mills, interesting man, not from Stockton, but when the draft came out and he enlisted in his town, their draft quota was filled, so they assigned him to Stockton to make one less for us. And Hilo and I recently visited his grave in Newburgh, I think it was. He needs a stone bad. He's got a bit of one, but it doesn't tell us much. And I'll work on that with the VA. He died 19 May 1864, Spotsylvania. Isaac Patterson, 19th Maine, head wound, died 22 May 1864. John Crooker, 1st Maine Heavy Artillery. We lost him 24 June 64. Charles Eastman, 17th Maine, died of wounds on 14 July 1864. Judah Thilley, 19th Maine, 30 August 64. Daniel Lampier, how do I say that, Kathy?
Depends on who's thinking about it. It could be Lanford.
I love that name. It's a hard one to work with, genealogy circles.
Oh yeah, 25 different ways to spell it that I've come across.
Daniel died 3 September 1864. He won a big battle. He died when he was shot in the hip performing picket duty or perimeter guard. Lewis Mudgett, we talked about before, the man who took over for the colonel and the lieutenant colonel. Last man to be killed in action from Stockton, 9 April 1865 in Mobile, Alabama. Most of the war, there were 2 times the men who died of disease then died of wounds. Fortunately for Stockton, that wasn't the case. We had 17 killed in action, only 15 by disease. Samuel Eames, March 62, Hiram Harriman, May 62, Summer Sanborn, July 62, Elmore Stevens, December 62, He died of typhoid aboard a transport ship, and they buried him at sea. I even have the coordinates. Edwin Roberts died on board a ship serving in the Navy in January 63. William Eaton died of disease in Baton Rouge. James Berry was a deserter and sentenced to confinement at Fort Pickens. He died of disease there. Edwin Stowers of disease, July 63. The second of 3 deserters to be sent to prison was Elba Partridge. He also died in Pickens of disease. Nathan Berry died of disease in October 63, not much detail. Manly Dickey got smallpox and died in February 64. William Goodwin, not enlisted, from Stockton. He happened to be in Indiana when the war broke out. He was in Company M of the 41st Indiana and died as a prisoner of war. I didn't put him on the POW list because he otherwise wasn't one of ours, but his folks were from Sandy Point, and he has a stone there. Austin Griffin died in May 64, 1st Maine Heavy Artillery. Augustus Gray, one of the 4 Gray boys, only one came home. Augustus died of disease in October 1864 in Washington, D.C., and Hiram Grant died of disease January 1865 in Washington, D.C., 3 months before Mr. Mudgett was last killed in action. My brother Sean Smith on the bugle. Let me close with a couple paragraphs. Last hour and 15 minutes was my love letter about the boys from Stockton. If any of you ever watched the Ken Burns special on the Civil War, you've heard this. This is a letter written 1 week before that battle, that first big battle, Battle of Bull Run, by a major in the 2nd Rhode Island, Sullivan Ballou. There's quite a bit to the letter. I'm going to read just kind of the last 2 paragraphs. As he writes to his wife, he says, "Forgive my many faults and the many pains I have caused you. How thoughtless, how foolish I have oftentimes been. How gladly would I wash out with my tears every little spot upon your happiness and struggle with all the misfortune of this world to shield you and my children from harm. But I cannot. I must watch you from the spirit land and hover near you while you buffet the storms with your precious little freight, and wait with sad patience till we meet to part no more. But, oh Sarah, if the dead can come back to this earth and flit unseen around those they loved, I shall always be near you in the garish day and the darkest night amidst your happiness happiest scenes and gloomiest hours always, always. And if the soft breeze fans your cheek, it shall be my breath. Or the cool air cools your throbbing temples. It shall be my spirit passing by. Sarah, do not mourn me, dear. Think I am gone, and wait for me, for we shall meet again. The last man who wants war is the guy who has to fight it. Thank you. And by the way, yes, he was killed at the Battle of Bull Run. Thank you very much.
We're playing too much.